muted during this presentation. If you are listening on the phone, we would ask you to please mute your computer, otherwise you will hear some feedback. Also, to maximize the screen, you would click the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and that will get rid of all of the extraneous information on the outside and just make the PowerPoint screen bigger for you. This may be useful at the beginning of the presentation when we show a few graphs. At the end of each section, which there will be 4 of today, there will be time for question and answers. You can feel free to put any questions into the screen, into the chat pod at any time, and when we do stop, I will read those out to our presenters. The chat pod is on the left-hand side for you. There is also a handout pod at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. We do have one resource for you in there that you can download if you would like to. And just a reminder that, as always, we will be sending 2 surveys out following today's webinar. One will come out directly today, and we'll ask you a few questions about the presenters and the content and any technical issues you may have had. That is where you would select whether or not you would like certificates of completion or CEUs for today's webinar. In about 3 months, you'll also receive a follow-up survey that will ask you 4 questions only. And what we're trying to gather from that survey is whether or not you've used this information that you've learned today in any way. So if you've passed it along to any of your colleagues, if you've implemented any of it, and that's the type of information we're looking for. Today we would like to thank the National LTAP and TTAP Association for co-hosting our event. And this is the NLTAP Safety Work Group who is co-hosting with us. So thank you very much for doing that. And I'll just give you a little bit of background about our 3 presenters before we get going. Rosemarie Anderson is with FHWA's Local and Rural Road Safety Program, as she is the manager of that. She is a transportation specialist with FHWA and leads the Human Factors, Work Zone Safety, MUTCD, and Distracted Driving for the Office of Safety. Previous to FHWA, she was the manager for the Office of Safety and Security Planning at Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, where she was instrumental in developing their safety program. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of the West Indies, Jamaica, and 2 Master of Science degrees from New Jersey Institute of Technology. We also have Ken Skorseth with us today. Ken is the Special Projects Manager at the South Dakota Local Technical Assistance Program at South Dakota State University, Brookings, South Dakota. In his 27 years with the South Dakota LTAP, he has served as the Field Services Manager and Program Manager. Prior to South Dakota LTAP, Ken also spent 12 years experience in the highway and heavy construction industry and 8 years as a County Highway Department Manager in Dual County, South Dakota. Ken served as the lead author of the Gravel Roads Maintenance and Design Manual, published in 2000 by the U.S. DOT FHWA, and completed a comprehensive revision of the manual, which was published in 2015, with a new title called Gravel Roads Construction and Maintenance Guide. He has also been published in several trade journals, such as Better Roads and Roads and Bridges. Ken was honored with induction into the South Dakota Transportation Hall of Honor in October 2010, for his lifetime achievements in assisting local transportation agencies. He is also past president of the NLTAP Association, a member of the National County Engineers Association for 28 years, and a member of the American Public Works Association for 22 years. And lastly, we will have David Veneziano, who is a safety circuit rider at Iowa LTAP at the Institute of Transportation at Iowa State University. Dr. Veneziano earned his PhD in Transportation Engineering from Iowa State University in 2006. He has over 11 years of experience in various aspects of transportation research, including safety and operational analysis, winter maintenance applications, intelligent transportation systems, and remote sensing. He has considerable research experience working with numerous agencies, including NCHRP, the Iowa DOT, Caltrans, the Oregon DOT, the Idaho Transportation Department, the Colorado DOT, and the Montana DOT, among others. In addition, his experience includes outreach and training activities for safety treatments, roadside safety, work zone flagging and safety, and roadway signing and marking. And so we would like to thank all 3 of them for joining us today, and again, thank NLTAPA for co-hosting with us. Today's goal for the webinar is that once you have completed this webinar, You will be familiar with the safety concerns and potential solutions on unpaved roads. And we have 4 learning outcomes for you, which will follow our sections in today's webinar. The first is to summarize the need for discussions on unpaved road safety. The second is to identify safety issues in gravel road maintenance operations. The third is to illustrate the safety effectiveness of traffic-controlled devices on unpaved roads. And the fourth is to summarize the next steps for unpaved road safety. And at this point, I would like to turn the presentation over to Rosemarie.
I think it's important that I take the phone off mute. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to focus mainly on the data. What is the data telling us about safety on unpaved roadways and some of the results of the NCHRP Synthesis Report 485, which is converting paved roads to unpaved roadways. Is there really a concern for unpaved road safety? In 2015, there were 546 fatal crashes on unpaved roads in the nation. And basically, it involved 584 vehicles. So 93% of those fatal crashes were actually single vehicle crashes. And the lifetime economic cost in 2010 dollars was $0.6 billion, which is, I'm not sure how many zeros there are, and if you can count that many zeros, it's a lot of money that we're talking about in terms of loss of life and in terms of economic cost. But also there's a large portion of our roadways are unpaved. We have 35% of those roadways unpaved. So how clear a picture do we have of the safety issues on unpaved roadways? We talk about towards zero deaths and road to zero. If we're intending on achieving any of those goals, we definitely have to address what's happening on unpaved roads in the country. You know the saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it really happen? Well, by that same premise, if a crash happens on a rural dirt road and no one sees it, did it really happen? If the driver is able to drive away or call his buddies to use a tractor to pull him out of a ditch, did it happen? Several crashes are going unreported, especially if there are no serious injuries involved or if it's a single vehicle crash. Currently, there are no comprehensive technical literature on unpaved roadways for safety. So there is underreporting of crashes on unpaved roadways, and we're looking at it in terms of there is no comprehensive literature in terms of unpaved roadway safety. So this shows the graph with a percentage of fatalities that are happening on unpaved roads. It has consistently been above 2% nationally over the last 5 years. There was somewhat of a decrease in percentage in 2015, but not totally reflected in the actual numbers of fatalities that actually happened. To many, this may be insignificant, given there are 50 times more deaths are occurring on paved surface roads. But when we start doing comparisons and we start looking at it in terms of VMTs, we may see another picture in terms of the significance of fatalities on unpaved road surfaces. This slide shows the distribution of fatalities by functional class. Approximately 3/4 of the fatal crashes are happening on local roads. These are roads that are mostly owned and operated by local governments. Major and minor collectors experience approximately 12% of the unpaved road fatal crashes. So a lot of these roadways are actually owned and operated by local governments. All the bars to the right of the local road bar represent crashes that cannot be assigned to a functional class. And this may be, some of these may be attributed to local roads, which are not being fully reported on as well. Looking at the unpaved road fatal crashes versus paved road by functional class, we see unpaved roads fatal crashes is approximately 10% of those on the local system. So we're looking at 10% of the paved road crashes are actually unpaved roads. That's a large percentage of fatal crashes that are happening on these local roadways. Approximately 2 and 1% of minor collectors and major collectors roads, respectively, are actually unpaved roads, are fatalities on unpaved roads as well. So this is interesting in that for 2015 unpaved road fatalities and the percentage by state. And the red line indicates the percentage, and the peaks in general indicate that states have fatal crashes higher than the nation's average. So you can see where the peaks are, and a number of these are over 5. We have 14 states which are over 5% of their fatalities are happening on unpaved roads in 2015, and 7 of these states are actually more than 10%. So this shows some of the states that actually was a part of the recent unpaved road safety peer exchange, the 9 states, and all are above the national average. And if you're seeing it, we have 6 of those states, which is over 10%. However, all of those states are also above the national average in terms of their mileage, unpaved road mileage also. Most are above the 50%, and 4 of them are over 70% of the road mileage within their state is unpaved. So in 2015, 44 states had fatal crashes on unpaved roads. However, there remains a potential for a large percentage of fatalities and serious injuries, and some factors to consider are a lack of maintenance, which Ken will talk about in his presentation. We also have ex-urban development, introduction of larger vehicles on a number of these roadways, larger agricultural equipment, and also the conversion of paved roads to unpaved roads, which also contribute to safety issues as well as unpaved roads. For the NCHRP synthesis report, the survey conducted of the respondents in that survey, 29 states indicated that they have or are in the process of converting some paved roads to unpaved surface. And the most common reason was the cost for maintenance. But does that represent a safety issue? So some of the findings from it also show that most of the roads that were being converted were less than 100 ADT. So there are less traveled roadways. And this suggested that many of the roads being converted probably should not have been paved, or that the road usage patterns have changed significantly since paving. So a primary reason for converting a road from paved to unpaved, as indicated in the report, in the literature, and from the survey and interviews for the report, is safety. Safety concern was also indicated as a reason in nearly half the conversions. Many agencies and practitioners contend that a gravel road can be maintained to a higher safety standard than a deteriorated paved road, and often at less cost. But how viable is that? However, gravel roads can still pose a variety of safety concerns, with poorly maintained gravel roads often being dusty and having washboards, loose gravel, potholes, which lead to unsafe and uncomfortable conditions. And my fellow presenters will talk a little bit more about some of those issues as well. So as I summarize this, crashes are occurring on unpaved roads, as you can see from the data, and there are fatal crashes that are happening. Do we have a good picture of what's happening to other types of crashes, crashes that are property damage only, crashes that only happen in minor damage. Their states are converting roadways. There's limited safety data, and there's a lack of technical information for improving safety on these roadways. And I think I'll turn it back over to Jamie.
Perfect. Thank you very much. At this time, we are going to stop and take some questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat pod. We are going to move over to a poll question for all of you in our audience, but that chat pod will still be there on the left-hand side. So the first question that we have for you guys is, which of the following is false? 44 states had fatal crashes on unpaved roads in 2015. Many states are converting their roads from paved to unpaved. Only 5% of roads are unpaved. The NCHRP Synthesis 485 was created to document road conversion information. Or I do not know, I do not remember. And again, this is which of the following is false. We'll give everyone a few minutes to, or a few seconds rather, to fill that out. And we did have one question that came through a private chat about the PowerPoint slides for today's webinar. Typically, we would put those as a PDF form in our handouts. They are not going to be available at this time. We are waiting for approval from FHWA to be able to post those. When they are available, we'll send a thank you email out to everyone who's attended for the link to where you can download those as well as watch today's archived webinar. Okay, and Rosemarie, it does look like everyone has filled this out at this time, so I'm going to have you go ahead and talk about the results.
Yes, well, the majority of you are actually correct in saying that only 5% of roads are unpaved. Actually, 35% of roadways in the nation are actually unpaved roadways.
And Rosemarie, while I do move us back over to the presentation, we did get one question for you. Do you have any information on the most common types of crashes on unpaved roads?
No, I don't.
Okay, and how about either of our other speakers?
But okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Rosemarie.
Yeah, there are several different things which Ken and David will talk about in their presentation, which causes crashes on unpaved roadways. I don't want to take the thunder from.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ken at this time to continue on, and we will get back to the question in the chat pod during David's section. So Ken?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are, especially to my friends in Canada as well. I'm going to make a comment about that question before I go into my presentation. The bulk of the crashes that I've had to deal with on unpaved roads have been single vehicle run off the road crashes where they either roll over or strike a fixed object. And then I'm going to hold this screen for just a moment, and I'll give you a little background to what I'm going to cover here in the next 20 minutes or so. I'd like to share my experience targeting primarily our local managers, and I noticed that is local agency managers, because I noticed they are also the largest portion or percentage of the group participating today. So county engineers, road superintendents and foremen, or even elected officials if we have them. I'll focus on you primarily, but hope to make it interesting to everyone. And here's the background, just expanding a little bit on how I've had to deal with this. Number one, it was hands-on. I did manage a county highway department, as it was mentioned, for 8 years. And the very day I started, I was informed that there was a pending claim against the county. Now that turned out to be a small one, and I learned that later. It's small potatoes, but you get nervous when you're coming in as a manager. It simply involved some vehicle damage from crossing a windrow. Then later on, bigger things, fatalities and so forth. And then, as was mentioned, I did 27 years with South Dakota LTAP, where I had to do a lot of advisory work. And then later on, I began to do work with unpaved roads as an expert witness. I'm really trying to get out of that. I'll tell you that up front. I'm working hard to retire. I also had to write a number of professional opinions regarding the facts, photos, and what have you in litigation. So I'm going to base my presentation on those things, and again, I hope it's helpful to everyone. Moving on then, I will build my presentation over these three items. Number one, and these haven't been, in my experience anyway, they're really big multi-million-dollar claims, but it's contributed to crashes, and that's just the fact we cannot get our operators to use the warning lights that they have, or B, sometimes these warning devices, primarily the flashing amber lights in most states, are not on the machine. Second one is big, roadway shape or roadway geometry, and I've certainly been involved with some crashes where this was a contributing factor. Sometimes it's simply alleged, it really isn't. Sometimes it really is. Those are tough. And then finally, the surface aggregate, surface gravel, whatever you call it. And again, that can be dicey, that can be difficult, and I'll show you some illustrations of it. I did want to comment a little bit before I go into what I've just defined about special operations. And we don't see these a lot on unpaved roads, but here you're seeing an aggressive rehab project. It's amazing. This county was doing this work on long sections of their unpaved road grid that they could do over a mile a day. Now, according to the MUTCD, your temporary warning devices would be adequate when your duration is only a day. And granted, again, ADT is very low on this road. It's under 50. If we could just get our local agencies to make use of good temporary signs, and I've got a great illustration there. I hope it's great anyway. A proper temporary sign, road work ahead, the standard sign, first warning in any project like this. And of course, you can have other warning signs out there, equipment working, be prepared to stop, and so forth. But this is lacking in too many projects, and this has contributed to a lot of problems. This one is an actual slide I chose to use. I don't think there's any great sensitivity here. This did not involve a fatal or even any significant injury, but a lot of property damage. And I had to give some advice on this one, but there was no way I could help my local friends. If you can see this sign, and I'll put in a little close-up of that, you know, listen, friends, that doesn't meet any part of the MUTCD regards shape, color, support, height above road. Everything is wrong here. And of course, this part of a split rim from an old truck wheel is a terrible way to support the sign. This sign was, I have no idea, something they had in the back of the shop, I guess, put it up. That was their primary warning. And believe me, that claim was lost. They paid, or that is the county's insurance carrier paid. But now I want to go into the much more everyday common things, and that's the lack of warning lights. Either they're not using them, and in this case, a gentleman that was working for me at the time shot an excellent picture here. Now they had signs up, but they also had good warning lights on the equipment. They even had a high-vis flag, which you don't see real well there, but out on the project you could. And this is a great example, but too often this is lacking. And believe me, when you've had a crash and litigation begins, if it goes that far, you have to defend yourself. And if lights were not turned on, or worse yet, were not even on the machine, you're going to have trouble defending yourself. It's a simple thing to remedy. If the light, especially that top light, is not there, get one on the machine and make sure the operators use them. I've been involved in two different incidents where the plaintiff's attorneys and or expert quickly did their homework and figured out the SMV, as we call it, or the slow-moving vehicle emblem, which is a requirement, at least in every state that I've worked in, it certainly is in my home state, was either A, not on the machines. Now, granted, it's secondary warning. It's not primary, but by law, it's got to be there. And it's either A, wasn't on the machine, or B, not visible, either obscured or so dirty you couldn't make out what it was. It's a small thing. The remedy's easy. Get it on the machine. If it's not there, make sure it's clean and visible. Now I'll go to a much tougher one, roadway geometry. And I split that into these three subpoints because this is what I've seen over and over in my experience. You could make it more broad, but I have limited time here. First of all, crown. Crown on the roadway itself, the traveled way. And it's either lack of it, but it can be excessive. And then the second one is huge. I've seen all kinds of allegations, different terms used, but in general, the surface was rough, it was unsafe. And those three things usually contribute, not all in the same incident, but corrugation, the engineering term, or washboarding, potholes, and then excessive windrows during maintenance operations. And then finally, problems with super elevation and curves. I've been involved in one in particular, involved permanent injury, huge claim, and unfortunately the agency really had a situation there that should have been remedied. These are hard to remedy, and I'll be quick to point that out. We'll talk about it a little when I get to a field scene. Lack of crown, it's pretty easy to identify here. Obviously, the water's not draining off, so there's no crown. You get some corrugation. Those turn into potholes. It does become rough and hard to control a vehicle. What's the remedy? Well, if you have a huge unpaved road system, you've got to do a lot of reshaping here. Hard to do it all at once. And here's what it comes down to, managers. You really have to pay attention to what your motor grader operators are doing or not doing, because that's the key remedy, to make sure they understand what the roadway shape should be and then get out there, try to establish that, and then maintain it. Not easy in some cases, and I'll be quick to admit that. But that is the remedy. You've got to reshape here and reestablish crown. On the other hand, I've had to deal with two cases in which excessive crown was an issue. And here's an illustration, and I'm going to mention something. With the exception of the first two photos I showed with that warning sign or bad warning sign, none of these are slides from cases in which I've been involved in. There are a lot of sensitivities with a lot of those, so I just picked these from my archives, and they're very good examples. But in this case, roadway top in the Central Great Plains region, we have a lot of these. It's right at 28 feet, hinge point to hinge point. Traveled way is easily about 23 or 4 feet, yet everyone drives in the middle. Why? Because crown on this road was right at 7%. And I can talk about that more in the chat if you like, but we like to see at or near 4% on the unpaved road. This exceeds it. Everyone drives in the middle. Sooner or later, someone meets another vehicle going over that little crest, and you have the potential for a head-on crash. I haven't seen a lot of those. I have seen some. These windrows. Now, this was a rehab project, more than routine maintenance. I can defend the use of a windrow. You have to work up a windrow to reshape a roadway. You've got to work up a windrow even to do routine maintenance, but be careful with those. There could be a reason to have a windrow of this size while you're doing aggressive rehab. Okay, but what's the remedy? Now it's not only lights and equipment, the SMV and so forth, but you need to treat this as a construction project and get up the or place the appropriate warning signs. Super elevation in a curve. Again, this is just a photo from my archives. But look at it closely, my friends. You might say this is super elevation in reverse. You look over the crest of that hill, the road curves to the right. The vehicle leans to the left. One of the more difficult cases I had to deal with and had to write a professional opinion I did manage to avoid deposition in that one, but it was this bad. Now, what's the remedy? The remedy here is not easy. You can't send a motor grader operator out this afternoon and say, all right, go out and reshape that road, get super elevation back in it. You would really have to do reconstruction. You'd have to do earthwork. My guess is this one was built wrong 40, 50 years ago, and it's not easy to remedy, but watch these. If you've got something this bad, you'd better get it on your priority list to do some, and I'm not saying you would need to rebuild an entire section of roadway, just rebuild this section where you've got lack of super elevation. Indeed, it's actually in reverse. Here's a shining example. I know how hard these are to maintain. And in defense of a motor grader operator, they're very challenging to maintain. But here's an outstanding example of a super. You can take this curve at around 50 miles per hour. The ball bank indicator would indicate that's a safe speed. Just remarkable good work by an operator who's doing a great job. But again, managers, take a look at your system. These lead to really serious litigation. Okay, here's perhaps the toughest one I've had to deal with. Surface problems, surface defects. This is severe corrugation or washboarding, to use that term. There are some other problems here. Lack of crown in the right-hand lower photo as well. But this is severe. What's the solution? Well, the temporary solution is to, again, get the motor graders out there, cut these loose, reshape and put the material back down, but unfortunately, generally, that's not going to correct the overall problem. You've got to change the surface aggregate, which is really the primary contributor to corrugation. It could be weak subgrade and so forth as well. Now, that's even a harder remedy. A reconstruction is just not feasible on most of these roads, but changing surface aggregate is something that you need to look at here. Now, here's another tough one, and I only have time to look at one of these, but what are the standards? We don't have all that much in the unpaved road industry. By the way, it was mentioned that I authored and then also was the lead author on the revision of the Federal Highway Administration's Gravel Roads Construction and Maintenance Guide. Okay, that's a good one. That's got general direction, guidance in the whole gamut of maintaining and managing unpaved roads. But this guide, and I'll call it that, by Eaton and Beecham, is one of the best ones you can turn to try to find some standards. And if you can read this, in this case, corrugation is the distress type being addressed, and then level of severity is addressed here, low, medium, and high. It's pretty basic. It's very easy to understand, and believe me, I've taken this document to depositions and to the courtroom more than once. It's very helpful. It does say that medium severity does not occur until you exceed 1 inch from the ridge to the bottom of the depression in depth, or up to 3. Now that's going to be hard to control a vehicle, but this does happen on roads, and you need to know what some of the standards are. Now I'm going to go to that last one, and that's surface gravel quality, aggregate, whatever you might call it. And here's what I've generally seen in claims. One of two things. The allegation, and it may be true, is the material does not meet a state specification or a standard specification. Now, I'll be quick to say a lot of states do not have a surface aggregate specification. A few states do. South Dakota, my home state, does. It's simply called gravel surfacing, although even there, my local friends are not held to that spec unless they're using state or federal funding on a project. But it's good guidance. The FHWA Gravel Roads Guide has some recommended specs in it. And then sometimes that second subpoint there, it's simply stated the gravel was not of the proper type. I've seen different wordings, and they simply cannot maintain a safe driving surface. That's what it always comes down to. Some of you have seen this slide. If you've heard me before, I've used this over and over. It's one of the best or worst examples that I've ever had regarding excess loose aggregate. What's the problem? Well, number one, overall, is it's a material that has no binding characteristic whatsoever. It has plenty of stone sizes and sand sizes in the gradations, virtually no fines, and the fines that are in it are non-plastic. In other words, plasticity index would show 0 or NP, non-plastic, on a lab test sheet. Is very hard to control a vehicle on a road like this. Second problem here, and you can't do anything about it, is it's in a semi-arid region where you don't get frequent rainfall, and that really aggravates the problem. But changing the material is the remedy. Now, depending on where you are and what aggregates are available, that can be a challenge as well, but you need to be aware of this and defend what you're doing. Here's a distinct contrast. Actually, these slides are not from the same county, but they're from the same state. They are perhaps 80 miles apart. This one, though, has actually higher traffic volume. That is, this road has higher overall traffic volume than the one I showed you previously, and yet you can see the road surface is in much better condition. This is easy to defend. You can't hold, and I've stressed that over and over, you cannot hold the agency to a pavement surface standard with unpaved. That's impossible. You will always have some loose aggregate. You may have some corrugation, but when you get this type of gravel, you also reduce corrugation significantly, and that's the remedy. And I'd like to close with a few general comments and a couple of photos. Risk is always there. If you're new as a manager, you can have a false concept. We've just got to go out there and eliminate it. In reality, you can't, but you've got to manage it. And then when you get into managing your risk on unpaved roads, there are some unique issues, and we've already looked at some of them. Managing unpaved roads, either informally or in a formal way, is much different from paved roads. Gravel roads can change in a day, depending on traffic volume and type and weather and so forth. And you just have to be very aware and make frequent inspections of your system. However, those last two sub-points that I put on this slide, I've had to face this many, many times in my career. There's an inherent belief that all unpaved roads are dangerous, or at least more dangerous than paved. Well, then if you turn that around, the last point, so are all pavements safe? Or in other words, are all paved roads safer? Well, okay, look at this slide. And I'd like to back up Rosemarie in what she stated. This is reality in a lot of places in the United States right now, and in Canada, and in other places in the world. Economics have changed a lot. The use of these roads has changed a lot, particularly in agricultural regions, but also resource recovery such as logging, quarry sources and so forth, where they're hauling aggregates on these low-volume roads. And it could be other things, but it's getting harder and harder to maintain a good paved system. This is actually a slide that I shot just a few years ago in Brown County, South Dakota. I have their permission to use it. They know that I use this slide for educational purposes. It was one of the worst spring thaw conditions they had ever had. You can see the vehicle far left. They're pulling clear off the pavement out in the shoulder, trying to avoid the severe breakup. They had section after section that looked like this on several of their roads. I was very sympathetic to them. What's the remedy? Well, listen, it's reconstruction. And it's huge. The dollar amounts in this case were unaffordable. Now, this road has been rehabbed since. The traffic volume on this one was too high. They did go back to an unpaved surface temporarily on parts of this, but this is what too many agencies face. And if you have very low ADT, as particularly that 100 vehicle per day and less, some of these will have to be reverted to unpaved. And it's not the end of the world, my friends. Look at this picture, please. This happens to be the same county, Brown County, South Dakota. the very same spring season. Now, this one had also gotten in very bad condition, but it's so much easier to rehab a gravel road and reconstruct for a fraction of the cost. So look at it. That is some aggressive reshaping done, a fresh layer of surface gravel hauled. As I recall, it was a 3-inch layer, and it's very high quality surface aggregate that goes into a bound state. So it's not insurmountable. I will stop there and turn this back to Jamie, and I hope this is helpful to everyone.
Thank you very much. And at this time, we will take questions. We have several of them in the chat pod already, but if there are additional ones, please add them there. I am going to move us over to the poll question as well for our audience to answer, and then we'll get started on those questions with Ken. Which of the following are maintenance operations safety issues on unpaved roads? Lack of warning devices on equipment used in maintenance operations, problems with roadway geometry, surface gravel quality, none of the above, all of the above, or I don't know, I don't remember. And Ken, one of the questions that did come in was that on one of the slides you had the special report 9226 from the Army Corps, and there was a question about sharing that link, and I did find it as well as did the person asking, but we are only able to find the report from 1992. Do you know if there's been an update, or is that the most current version?
Yes, I can answer that quickly. That has never been revised, and the 1992 version is still current, so to speak. And I'm not too concerned about that because it's covering principle, and that really hasn't changed in our business. I would prefer we had some more up-to-date illustrations, which would be so much easier done today with modern computer graphics software. But the principles really haven't changed in that one. I could have included that as well. I apologize. I referenced it, and it didn't occur to me. Could we put that in our handout section, Jamie?
Absolutely. I did just add the link to the chat pod for everybody. And when we do post the PDF and the recording for today, we will make sure that that is on the resource slide that will show up at the end of tonight's presentation. So.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, our poll question is done, so I'm going to broadcast that for you if you could address it, and then we'll start with some of the questions in the chat pod.
Okay, rounded, 90% of people have the right answer. All of the above are true. Lack of warning devices, the problems with geometry, the surface gravel quality. None of the above could be correct because there are other issues that I wasn't able to cover in the short time I have. But the correct answer would be all of the above.
Perfect. And we'll get started on some of these questions for you as well. One of them is, what is the % of unpaved roads in Texas, and how is the information obtained from local agencies? I'm unsure if you'll have that information.
I've worked in Texas, but unfortunately, I do not know off the top of my head what the percentage of the unpaved road grid is there. That's a challenge in a lot of states, and I can't speak for Texas. In my state, South Dakota, we have an outstanding inventory maintained by our South Dakota Department of Transportation, and the information is readily available. I cannot speak for Texas. I do know in some states we do not have a good composite inventory of the entire road grid, local, state, federal, and others. Consequently, it's impossible to know what the percentage of unpaved is. I wish I could help you, but I don't know that one, Jamie.
Okay, no problem. I know we do have some listeners today from Texas, so if you do have that information, if you would put it in the chat pod, we'll be glad to announce that information. Another question that we got for you was that you mentioned the most common accident you've seen being a single vehicle. What percentage of accidents would you estimate are vehicles colliding with maintenance equipment or vehicles?
Yeah, I can answer that quickly, and I feel this is quite accurate. It's only about 20%. The serious ones that I've been involved in are virtually always the single vehicle, losing control, running off the road, and then it either rolls over or strikes a fixed object. In one case, that was nothing but a large round bale of hay, but it was a serious incident. And again, those are the most common. I don't know if we have a good hard statistic on that in the nation or in any state, but in my experience, I'm confident in saying it's only been about 20% or 1 out of 5 where it's either collision with another vehicle or a piece of maintenance equipment, usually the motor grader in those cases.
Thank you. The next question is, what methods have you used to get the PI increased on a gravel road?
There's not a single method that we've used, but here are the 2 most common things we've used. We've encouraged agencies to simply change the specification when they're purchasing surface aggregate. Now, again, there's a recommended specification in the FHWA Gravel Roads Guide. I feel that's a good one. I can defend that. I've seen it work in many places. One challenge with that, though, is too many commercial aggregate suppliers really don't have a good surface aggregate. If you set a specification that they must meet, they either A, won't, or B, they're going to tell you we don't have it, and they won't bid. They tend to play hardball in too many situations that I've been involved in. So I'll talk about the second way that we've been able to get plastic fine material into the surface gravel, and that is by adding a natural clay right out on the roadway and blending it in. That's a special operation again. It's not an easy remedy. However, I will tell you I've seen this actually cost effective because it not only reduces your risk greatly, it actually reduces maintenance if you calculate a life cycle. But you're going to spend money up front to find a source of good natural clay, then get it out there and blend it into the surface aggregate. But we've had some great success with that.
I just wanted to mention for everyone as well that unsurfaced road special report has now been added to the handout pod as well, so you can download that. And the report that Ken was just talking about on gravel roads, the design guide, will be shown to you at the very end of today's webinar, the link for where you can download that as well. So the next question for you is, how effective are signs indicating the road is not regularly maintained in preventing or mitigating lawsuits, especially on very low volume roads?
It's a tough question. And the gentleman following me may have better information on that. Here's my personal experience. Some states have statutory support for a sign that generally will say minimum maintenance, travel at your own risk. State of Minnesota has that, for example. My home state, South Dakota, has that. When you have statutory support to do that, it's helpful. It does reduce crashes, too, because the sign does warn a prudent person to be careful, but it really gives you defense if there is a crash. People, and that sign is virtually always the standard warning sign, pennant, diamond, black on yellow. When that sign is up, clearly visible, placed properly, you've got a lot of protection there from the fact that you simply cannot do aggressive maintenance on those roads. And that's a very real factor in many places, and I understand that. But I would defer any other comment on that to the gentleman following me.
Okay, so we'll remember to ask that question to David again at the end. Another question that came out for you is, for western states and dry regions, what would be a good binder for gravel roadways?
Regardless of where you are, but I do understand western region tends to be dry, and that's where the bigger challenges come in. Natural clay has worked the best for us. You can go to some of the specialty products like bentonite. Bentonite's actually a clay, but it's highly plastic. You have to be very careful with it. That really needs to be incorporated with a machine, but that will work. There are a lot of commercial binders for the, well, yes, I'll use that term. That's very generic, but commercial binders that are available ranging from emulsified asphalts to, well, polymers and so forth. To be very honest, folks, I haven't had a lot of success with those. And here's my advice if you're going to try those. Use them on a test section only. Just pick 1,000 feet somewhere that's a troublesome spot on your unpaved road system, and then try the product. I'm not saying they don't work. I've seen in some, matter of fact, up in the North Dakota oil fields, in recent years, we did see some of those products work in a test reasonably well, but be very careful with them. Natural clay or bentonite is easier. We know what they are, we can test, we know what the plasticity is, and then blend it in, we can figure out what the end result would be. But I do want to mention again the commercial stabilizers. It's an option, but I've already given advice on how I would approach that.
Thank you again, Ken. And we do have several questions remaining in the chat pod. I am going to move on to David right now just to make sure he has enough time to present. But we will come back to those questions at the end. And I did want to also mention that someone has been kind enough to post the Texas roadway inventory link in the chat pod for the person who asked the question about the Texas roads. At this point, David, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you to get started with your section.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Jamie. So what I'm going to be covering this morning is what I would characterize as being more of a general overview of the effectiveness of some of the signing that we would commonly see along our unpaved roadways. The overview itself is by no means comprehensive. It doesn't cover every sign that's out there, and there's some reasons behind that. And when I go through the slides, you'll begin to see why that is. I will follow up briefly just because it was a topic that just came up in one of the questions regarding the minimal maintenance signs. You'll see they don't appear in this overview. It's not intentional. We did a search on that when we were looking during the course of the work that developed what you're going to see in this information. There really isn't anything out there in terms of any evaluation. I'm not talking safety or operationally. You know, what reaction do people have to these signs? There was nothing even documenting any of the legal challenges related to those signs either. So I'll put that out there as I get underway. One thing I do want to point out is what I'm covering here resulted from a project that we undertook in Iowa over the last couple of years that was looking at the effectiveness of signs, and it was in response to a question we were getting from some of our engineers related to they wanted to start pursuing sign minimization. And so many of our counties have a lot of signs out there, especially on our unpaved network, and they were looking to potentially address some budget issues they were facing by removing some of their signs and not having to go forward continually maintaining these because there is an expense tied to them. And so they just wanted to have some information that says, hey, what's the impact of these signs? Should we be keeping them out there? And so that's the rationale behind the material that you're going to see me covering in the next few slides. So I think all of us on this webinar would agree that we face a number of safety conditions out on our unpaved roadways that have a direct impact related to signing. Intersections certainly are the big one that would come to mind. In the level of control there, whether it's yield, stop control, uncontrol. There's going to be signage tied to that in many cases. But we also have to provide warning for features related to things like, narrow roadways, limit or no shoulders. We're giving warning on that. And certainly the big one out there is curvature and providing warning there. Of course, there are other items that I probably don't have listed here that you could name off the top of your head as well that we try to address through the use of some of our signage. The point I'm making here, though, is just like on our paved system, our unpaved system has a number of different aspects that we need to be thinking about in relation to the need for signing and what signing is appropriate for a certain condition. So what can we do to address these? Well, I mentioned already there are a few big items that we're really concerned with when it comes to signing. Curves are one that really come up quick. The picture you see here is it's an elongated reverse curve. I took this out in the field while we were doing safety assessment at county. The curve I'm standing in is actually signed, but the curve at the far end, if you can even make out that there's a curve there, is not signed. And so we have a lot of situations like this throughout the country where we've kind of done piecemeal signage where we've addressed the condition. In this case, they signed the curve because a crash happened there. And we're talking a very low volume road here. I think it was like 5 to 10 ADT. But a crash did happen here, and so they put up signs in the curve that it happened at without looking, 0.2 of a mile down the road and saying, oh, hey, we've got the same condition right over there. Let's put signs out. So really, we're trying to provide critical warning in cases like this. Tangents, we have situations too where there's a tangent and there's things that we need to provide warning with there, whether it's roadside delineation for a hazard, a culvert, or whatever that we need to point out to drivers, but there is a need there. And of course, then we also have to implement intersection control in a lot of cases where we believe that uncontrolled situations are no longer sufficient. Of course, the other thing to think about, and Ken touched on this a little bit already when he mentioned SMVs on vehicles getting dirty, our signs get dirty too, and so we have to maintain our signs, we have to be cleaning those, and I'll touch on that a little bit later on as we go through these slides. So of course we can always install signs. There's a cost involved there, but if we really think a situation necessitates it, and certainly if the MUTCD warrants it, we're going to have to put the sign in. We can put those in when they're already present. So for instance, the stop ahead sign, in this case we're approaching the crest of a hill, and so that's a good reason why we have this type of sign out on our unpaved roadways. You wouldn't know there's a stop sign up about a quarter mile ahead over the crest of that hill without this sign. We can always enhance our signs. We can move to making them more conspicuous. We can add pennants. The bottom photo is a case where pennants would probably help that sign stand out a little bit more versus the background that you're looking at as you're approaching the intersection. We can move to things like oversized signing, more reflective sheeting. We can even put in post reflectors, post-mounted reflectors over the length of the post below the sign, things like that, just so that we can, provide a little bit more notice that the sign is there, make it stand out, and certainly then produce a benefit in reducing our crashes on our unpaved roads. One thing I forgot to mention, but I'll mention it now, in the course of this work, and we'll see this as I go through the slides as well, the results that I'm going to cover are coming from primarily paved roads, and maybe 1 or 2 instances did we find any sort of past research results or evaluation results that came off of an unpaved roadway. I'll point those out when we get to them, but all of the information I'm talking about here is generally in the report, it's coming from our paved roadway network. We believe that a lot of the information is transferable over to our unpaved network, but it certainly is a gap in the knowledge base in knowing what the impacts of these signs are out on our unpaved network. And the report I just mentioned is available in that handouts box in the left-hand corner. It's the sign effectiveness guidance. So all the information I'm covering there is available in that, and you're certainly welcome to use it and follow up with me if you have any questions related to it. I mentioned already, the question of sign minimization comes up. We certainly do want to avoid over-signing, and so we don't want to put more signs than we need out there. But there are cases where, sign may no longer be needed, and it certainly is acceptable to do that type of removal. My personal caution to that is document everything that you're doing, why you're doing it, when you did it, and have the background support you need in case a question or anything comes up in the future related to that. So I think, again, this isn't a comprehensive list. Some of you would be able to name some other signs that commonly appear in your locale along your unpaved roadways, but really there are some common sets of signs that we see out on our unpaved roads, right? Stop signs, yield signs, Some states may or may not use speed limits. Iowa doesn't necessarily post speed limits on its unpaved roadways, but other states may. Chevrons, curve warning, those sorts of things that are providing advance warning as you're approaching the curves. Large arrows, that's another common one. We see those at T intersections to let people know that there's, the road does not continue ahead. And then bridge-related signs, pavement ending signs, those types of signs. The question that we faced when we started our work here in Iowa was, have they been studied, first off? And then, if they have been studied, what's their effectiveness been? Effectiveness in terms of, do they reduce crashes? Do they have an impact on vehicle speeds and so forth? What we found is, in large part, these signs really haven't been studied. There are a couple of reasons we think that are behind this. One is people like to focus, researchers like to focus on, for lack of a better word, glamorous signs. So stop signs that have LED flashing borders are glamorous. An intersection collision warning system, something that has kind of bells and whistles attached to it, tends to get the focus of research now. The other thing I think is that's happening, that's behind this, is a lot of these signs have been out there for decades, right? Stop signs have been out there for a very long time, speed limit signs, and so we just kind of take it as gospel truth that they work, and they don't need to be studied. We think that somebody must have studied that 50 years ago, found that it works, and so that's why we're using it. And to an extent, they do work. But in the sense they work, we haven't necessarily done any rigorous evaluations on a lot of these signs. So what you can see here is a table that covers our basic signs that we'll see along our unpaved roadways, METCD requirements, in some cases where the signs are required, you'll see that checked off. But then the other two columns are showing you where safety studies have been done, or operational studies. And in a lot of cases, once you get down to those more specialized signs, road narrows, one-lane bridge, end of pavement type of signs, minimum maintenance levels type of signs, those haven't been studied. And so it's certainly a gap that we think needs to be addressed as we go forward. The other thing I mentioned already a little bit, in addition to little research being done on this, is the focus has been primarily on the paved system. Of course, there's a good deal of mileage out there on our paved system, so certainly that's where the focus has been, and a lot of our signs end up on the paved system. But really, again, it's a key gap that we think needs to be addressed. What we did as part of this work was we stepped back and we looked critically at what did the researchers, or those who did the evaluation, what did they do? How robust or how reliable was the study they did and the results they generated in terms of what they're saying in terms of crash reduction or speed reduction? Can the results be trusted? Can these be applied widely across our roadway system, or are they only limited to the situations that those people studied? So what we did was, those of you familiar with the Highway Safety Manual and the Crash Modification Factor Clearinghouse know the CMF Clearinghouse has safety ratings. It's a star level system, 1 through 5 stars, 0 through 5 stars. And basically what we did was look at what they're doing, the methodology, how they assign the star values, and applied that to what we were doing with this work. And so we kind of distilled things down to a low, medium, or high rating based on the CMF scale, if it was a safety study. If it was an operational study where they were doing a evaluation of speeds of vehicles at a site, we'd use that same low, medium, and high type of rating system, but we tried to adapt what the CMF Clearinghouse approach takes into account, number of sites, statistical approach, those sorts of things, and apply that to an operations study. So the details are in that report, but that's kind of the high level of what we tried to do, just to give a characterization to the reader that, hey, here's the reliability of this particular results. In a lot of cases, what we found were the results generally apply to the conditions that were being studied. So if it was a urban arterial, high volume, high traffic volume, then those results probably, if it was a medium or low study, they're only going to be applicable to that type of site, as opposed to a high-rated study where you could take those results, even if they were on a paved urban arterial, and transfer that crash modification factor that they generated down to an unpaved type of site. So there were really, I'm going to cover, just for the sake of time, 3 of the signs we looked at: stop signs, yield signs, and then curve warning signs, kind of lumped together: chevrons and curve warning and advisory speed plaques. On the stop sign side, what we found are signs generally were all over the place in terms of their effectiveness. Mostly medium or high ratings on these studies. Stop signs are one of the studies that we found where there had been some work done on unpaved roads. So all the studies, as I mentioned, were medium or high. One study came from multiple states, and that's the first one actually listed here with the increase in control. It was Texas, New York, and Florida. They found that increase in level of control, so going from yield to stop sign, for example, didn't significantly reduce crashes. Iowa did a study on unpaved roads, and that's the second one, that found there was no significant difference between crash rates at intersections with stop control versus uncontrolled situations. So that was another medium reliability. Generally has to be applied to very similar sites. In that case, they were looking at low volume, less than 400 vehicle a day type of intersections. There is a highly rated study for stop signs that got into conversion of two-way stop control to all-way stop control. Found a pretty significant crash reduction there. It makes sense. Anytime you're increasing the level of control, hopefully you're going to see a crash reduction resulting there. The same Iowa study, that last point that is down there, is also an Iowa study. And that basically looked at the crash rate at ultra-low volume intersections. So we're talking less than 150 vehicles a day. And what they found were those uncontrolled intersections, it appeared that they had a lower crash rate compared to always stop controlled intersections that were falling above that 150 vehicle a day level. So the work that they were doing there was basically to determine whether or not uncontrolled was a situation that could keep going on. They found that generally it was for those types of sites when you got into those ultra low volumes. Operationally, it's surprising in some sense, but I guess on the other hand it isn't. Only one study is out there that really looks at the operational effects of a stop sign. And what they did was, what this study had done, this was that Texas and New York and Florida study again, was just look at who was voluntarily stopping. And it's a fairly dated study there. It's about 40 years old now. And they found 19% of people at that time were stopping at 2- and 4-way stops. Hopefully that stop compliance has gone up over time. I think some of us would probably say, well, it probably hasn't, but it was an interesting finding in the sense that really, back then at least, people were kind of, I think, making more rolling stops than would have been expected at the time. Yield signs, we do have a few of these out, depending on the area of the country you're in, along our unpaved roadways, and so we wanted to look and say again here, what are the results going on with these? Only a couple studies are out there. One on the safety side is certainly low and should be looked at with caution. Operationally, at least, it was a study we would characterize as medium reliability. Safety-wise, conversion to stop or yield found an increase in crash frequency. That was sort of interesting because from stop to yield, it's interesting in the sense that you're going down in control somewhat, and so you would expect to see a bit of an increase there as people were kind of maybe still in the mindset that it was a stop-controlled intersection and making a wrong maneuver when they should be yielding to oncoming traffic. Operationally, very small travel time savings. in the switch from stop control to an uncontrolled or yield control type of situation. We're talking on the order in the study that they found 2 to 4 seconds, which, yeah, when you add it up over the course of a day and multiple vehicles at a site, that kind of adds up to real time. But really, you can make the argument: does the average driver notice that they're losing 2 to 4 seconds making a yield maneuver sometimes at an intersection? It's a toss-up there, but really, it's whether or not those results are practical is kind of a question that has to be thought through. Speed limit signs, as I mentioned, some states have these out there on their unpaved roads, some don't. And so just to go very briefly over what we've found there, no one has actually looked at the before and after effects either on the safety or operational side of what happens if we put a speed limit sign out where there wasn't one. What we had to rely on here was just looking at what have the effects on safety been if we see an increase increase or decrease on speed limits, or what do people do while driving speed-wise when a speed limit is increased or decreased. So generally, medium or low-rated studies are out there related to the safety effects. What you would expect would happen, it has been documented. Average crash rates have risen when speed limits are increased. You can see the numbers there. Other studies have found no change or no decrease in crash rates when speed limits have been changed. So, again, the information's kind of all over there. It depends on the location that was being studied, depends on the approach statistically that was being used to evaluate the site. Those sorts of things all play a role. And then one study also found that crash rates increased as the variability in vehicle speeds increased. So it stands to reason, the more variability we have out there, the higher the chance is that we're going to see a crash occur. And so that was a relatively older study. It received a low rating because it was very simplistic. Operational effectiveness side, the one study that was done found no evidence that drivers' speeds changed when a speed limit was raised or lowered. And so if they were already going faster, they kind of were already matching the higher speed limit that was the change put into place, and when a speed limit was lowered, they really didn't change their speed behavior either. So that was a medium study. Questionable, a little bit more reliability than a low-rated study, but again, it's one of those where you would have to think through the results with some caution if you were going to consider making a change in your locale. So curve warning signs, we have a few of these that are pretty common out on our unpaved roadways. There's certainly a lot of locations where we still need them and haven't necessarily put them out. But we do have options there. The horizontal alignment certainly is a common one. Thinking back to Ken's slide of the super elevation gone wrong in that one curve, that's certainly a curve where you would hope there's at least an advanced warning sign, a horizontal alignment sign, just to let people know there's a curve up ahead. Hopefully they'll slow down and drive more cautiously through it before the roadway can be fixed. Of course, we can add an advisory speed plaque with that to give them some indication of how fast or what the highest speed they should be traveling through is. Chevrons are common, certainly growing in more use, and that's a good thing. Adding reflective sheeting or going to oversized chevrons is another option that we have available. And then also just even the idea of post-mounted delineators, that's an option we have for curves too, just providing drivers with some positive visual confirmation of the path of the curve that they can follow when at night. It's certainly going to go a long way, especially to helping them make it through. All the results I'm going to cover in the next couple of slides are related to paved roads. Again, we think that it's transferable fairly well to an unpaved situation, but it's certainly interesting that one of the more common signs we would see out on a lot of our unpaved roads, some of these curve warning type signs, really haven't been studied in an unpaved situation. But of course, fortunately, what you would expect is the case is indeed happening. We're seeing positive effects with these signs being used, whether they're being used individually or in combination with another. And when I say in combination, I mean a curve warning sign in addition to chevrons throughout the curve, that's certainly having an impact. Chevrons themselves are showing crash reductions. There's a wide range in there. Certainly a high-rated study is one that we certainly think can be applied across the board, certainly transfer those numbers over to an unpaved type of situation as well. I want to throw out there is one study out there, and I think a lot of people have seen this. It's fairly old now. It's about 20 or 25 years old. That shows chevrons reduce crash frequencies by up to 50%. It's what we would characterize as a low-rated study, very simplistic. They just compared before and after crash numbers. No sort of statistical evaluation done there to account for changes in traffic volumes or any of those types of conditions that are going on behind the scenes. So certainly it's a big number that jumps out to you, but when you see a big number like that, whether it's, you're seeing it in things like the report that we put together here, or just any general type of report that you're seeing, when you see that big of a jump, it's one of those things we would urge you to kind of say, and that's kind of a red flag. Look a little bit more closely at what they did and make sure they're not doing some sort of simplistic comparison there. When we looked at chevrons being used with curve warning signs, those two together, they reduced crashes by a wide range. Certainly, again, when you threw in advisory speed plaques, that also has an impact, helping in reduced crashes. And then when we just looked at, when we found the one study again that looked at just curve warning signs, no chevrons in that case, but just a curve warning sign in advance of curves. It was another one of those big numbers that kind of jumped off the page. Wow, 42% reduction, and certainly they did see reductions at that site. But again, there was no statistical evaluation. They were just comparing before and after numbers. So again, just use caution when you see results like that come up in the course of your daily work. On the operational side, all these signs, again, they produce impacts on speeds. They did reduce speeds. In terms of, when we looked at chevrons, that was the one that was commonly evaluated. People wanted to see what happens when you put a new chevron out versus a situation where there wasn't one. And so there were statistically significant speed drops found. This goes back to something I said earlier, though. You look and you say, okay, mean speeds fell by 1 to 3 miles an hour. Yes, statistically it may be significant, but from a practical sense, is it significant? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Certainly in my mind, at least, it's showing that there is some driver reaction, even if they aren't slowing down a great deal. At least it shows, I think, that they're aware that they're driving through a curve, they're a little bit more cautious, hopefully paying more attention. And that's a good thing. There was one study out there that looked at advisory speed plaques, just looked at what they've done in terms of having an impact on driver behavior and what they found in speeds. And so what that one found was, well, by the time most drivers, at least almost close to 2/3, were within the curve or had gone at least 1/3 of the way into the curve, they were still exceeding the posted advisory speed. So the effectiveness from a speed perspective is not necessarily showing what we would hope it is, or it should, but it certainly is. Again, we're providing some form of warning. Hopefully, even if they aren't slowing down, at least they're paying more attention and navigating that curve with a little bit more focus than they necessarily would have been otherwise if we hadn't put that sign out. Beyond that, the signs that we looked at didn't really apply in a unpaved situation. So those are really the big ones that are in the unpaved category there that we could cover a little bit in the course of these slides. There are a couple other considerations I want to touch on, though, before I wrap up on the slides. One, again, ties back to what Ken had mentioned earlier, related to the dirty SMVs on vehicles. Same principle applies to our roadside signs. And we're kicking up dust out on our unpaved roadways. That dust sticks to things, including our signs. The bottom photo that you see here in the center is a sign I drive by pretty much every day on the way to work. I noticed it once winter came along and I was driving in the dark, that basically, yeah, you see it fine during the day. You could tell it was dirty. At night, it's dirty enough now that even the retroreflectivity on that sign really, it doesn't work. And so this was a case where a sign was dirty. It stayed dirty for about a year. They cleaned it. It was pretty noticeable when they cleaned it because all of a sudden it was reflective again, and it was white at night when I'd approach it. And so certainly keep that in mind. Clean those signs, when they get dirty. Have your operators out there on the graders keep an eye on it and report back if they think a sign needs to be cleaned. Because certainly, these signs, especially at night when that retroreflectivity isn't there, they do make a difference. We're out in rural areas. There's not a lot of light outside of the headlights at night. We need to be making sure our signs are reflective to provide that guidance to drivers. Knockdowns, vandalism, those are a couple big ones. Some of our signs get knocked down. Certainly this time of year, hunting season's ramping up in many of our areas. When there's nothing around to hunt, signs sure make a good target for vandalism, don't they? Keep an eye on those. Replace them when you've got too many bullet holes. Make sure that you're keeping on top of that. Same with replacing stolen or missing signs. Sometimes it happens. Signs make a great dorm room decoration in some kids' minds. So keep that in mind. Replace them when you need to, when they've gone missing, and certainly look at anti-theft bolts and those sorts of things if you think it's going to be an ongoing concern. Vegetation, that's another big one we face in a lot of our rural areas on these unpaved roads. Just keep an eye, make sure that you don't have a condition like the one you see on the right, where that vegetation is basically engulfing the chevron sign at this point, because once that happens, the sign's it's there, but it's not doing its job. It's not visible to drivers. I mentioned sign minimization as being kind of one of the rationales behind why we started looking at the effectiveness of these signs. And it's certainly a valid consideration. Budgets are always under pressure. Signs are an item which, they're generally low cost until you add them up across the system, and that starts to become a big ticket item. What I would say, what we found during the course of this work, one of the things we did was look and see if anyone's looked at how do I remove signs, what's the process, what should I be doing. There's not a lot of information out there for you if you really want to look at removing signs. In the end, what we really concluded in this is a lot of these signs are, if you look through the MUTCD, they're a judgment call on the part of an engineer. And so just as installing them is a judgment call, the removal of that sign is going to be a judgment call as well. And so the one thing I'll stress in closing here before we move over to questions is if you're going to remove a sign, document your decisions, keep a record, do the background legwork, do the studies if you need to that show here's why I'm taking the sign out. Here's what the thought process was, just so you have that record available. Jamie?
Thank you very much, David. And we do realize that we are running short on time, so we are going to skip the poll questions and some of the wrap-up slides and go straight to all the questions in the chat pod, because we do want to be able to answer as many of those as possible. When we are able to post the PDF, you can take a look at the last couple of slides that we would have gone over. So, David, I do want to go back to the question that was asked earlier that was deferred for you, and that is, how effective are signs indicating the road is not regularly maintained in preventing or mitigating lawsuits, especially on very low volume roads?
So that one, as I touched on, we did search for any sort of studies that were done related to that sign. We didn't expect necessarily to see an operational safety study related to it. I was surprised there was no sort of type of document or anything that discussed any illegal what the outcomes of the lawsuit had been related to those signs. And so I'll go back to what Ken had said, which is, statutory support exists out there in most states. That's certainly my experience in Iowa. I cannot even recall a case that's come up with our minimum maintenance signs at this point that have been challenged effectively and had a negative outcome. The statutory support is there that says it's posted, you had the warning, it says travel at your own risk, and so you're covered in that respect. But unfortunately, I have not seen anything out there in terms of documentation on any sort of impacts that those signs have from a legal standpoint.
Thank you. The next two questions were directed for Ken. So Ken, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself again just so that you can answer these two questions, please. And the first of those is, would you say that in terms of liability that our goal should be to keep corrugation below 1 inch?
Yes, I saw that, and that is a good goal. I also would add to that, in a dry region, you're going to have corrugation even with the best of surface aggregate. And if you really look at that and measure it, you'd be surprised how difficult it is to drive on a corrugated surface that even goes into that medium range of severity. So I would say try not to let it go more than 2 inches. That goes into the middle of that medium range. But I found that is defensible. But again, when you drive it, you'd be amazed how difficult it is to control a vehicle even on that. So 1 inch is a great goal. Try not to let it get worse than 2.
Perfect, thank you. The next question for you as well is, can downposting the speed help reduce accidents and longevity of unpaved roads? And if so, where has this been successful?
My quick answer is yes. If you can reduce speed on a gravel road or an unpaved road, you're going to reduce some of the surface distress, especially the displacement of aggregate, which leads to the loose aggregate distress, and it will reduce corrugation. However, I am as frustrated as David is when we look at some of these things. I know that from my gut. I know that from experience, but I cannot quote a study that absolutely says black and white, yes, here's what our severity rates were prior and here's what they were afterwards. But I've seen it. In particular, one road that comes to mind was a commercial access road to a large dairy that remained unpaved. In that case, they reduced speed to 35 miles per hour, even though the road was straight as a string for 3 miles and it had good overall cross-section. Putting the sign up would have done little to help us, but the county sheriff gave them support and they got good enforcement. It was interesting. I'll simply take the local agency's input. They told me their blade maintenance frequency was reduced to about 1/2. Now that's impressive, but it's only someone telling me that and no real measurement or documentation.
Thank you very much. I believe that this next question is for David, but Ken, if it makes more sense for you to answer it, please feel free. The question itself is, why are options showing 50% crash reductions given low rating and those with 4 to 25% reduction given a high rating?
So I touched on that a little bit. The reason that you see that is tied to the evaluation approach that the researcher used. And so in the case of those big numbers, the 50% one, that particular study had just compared before and after crash numbers, and so they lumped, off the top of my head, I can't remember how many years of data in the before period versus the after period. But they didn't account for changes in traffic volumes at the site and all those sorts of things that if you go through the highway safety manual, they lay out and say, you need to be thinking about these, you need to be thinking about the regression to the mean trend and all those things that go on behind the scenes. And so that's not to say that they didn't see that reduction. They saw a significant reduction at that site. It's just From a statistical sense, it wasn't a very rigorous study, and so that's why it had a low rating. I guess the way I would characterize is that what they had done was a quick and dirty approach. It gave them a quick answer. They did see a reduction at that site, but whether it was really a 50% reduction or whether that number was varied compared to some of those lower figures, the 4 to 24% range, where they had done a rigorous evaluation, there were some differences going on there.
I think that's good analysis, Jamie. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, perfect. The next question is, what type of pennant would be used on a rural stop sign?
You know, off the top of my head, the go-to, at least here in Iowa, is just a couple of metal, we call them pennants, we call them flags sometimes, but the little metal squares that come out of the top of the sign going in opposite directions at kind of 45 degrees. They're red, and that's, you know, they're basically just there to call a little bit more attention to the sign being there.
Thank you. And Ken, this last question is for you. The person from FHWA asking it says they're not aware of studies on this, but it seems to me that the big safety concern on gravel roads is the inconsistency of surface condition. Always bad or always good is probably relatively safe, but when we introduce washboards only at the curves, I suspect that's a real problem. What do you think, Ken?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Corrugation or washboarding is almost always a spot condition, not applicable or not appearing on the entirety of a section. And if I'm understanding the question correctly, again, we don't have studies on that, but if you can simply address those spots that give you trouble, and now I'll address this to our local managers as well. It's expensive to go out and modify surface aggregate even with a natural clay. And if you can do spot work only, I'm expanding on this a little bit, but if you can do spot work only to correct those, you're going to improve safety on that road section dramatically.
Perfect. Thank you very much, and thank you for answering all those questions. I know that we are a few minutes over time, but I am going to have Rosemarie talk about this last slide, and then we'll get wrapped up so everyone can go about their day. Rosemarie?
Yes. Well, I hope everyone can glean something from this webinar and from my fellow presenters' information as well. One of the things that we've seen, and I've gone through all the presentation, was the uncertainty and the lack of information on unpaved road safety. One of the things that we are doing is actually we have a solicitation out for a pool fund study. The Transportation Pool Fund Program allows federal, state, and local agencies, as well as other organizations, to combine resources to support transportation research studies. And we heard from David, we heard from Ken that there's a lack of research in certain areas. And this pool fund study is out for solicitation right now. The solicitation is open, and you can find it at the link that is shown on the slide here. And the project would be exploring ways to advance safety on unpaved roadways. So it would be addressing some of the information or some of the lack of information that we've heard of today. The solicitation closes on June 2018. We've had some folks who have already contributed. You can talk to your state DOTs. They can use federal funding for this. They don't necessarily have to use their own state funds for this program as well. All the details can be found on the at the link that I have on the screen. So thank you very much. If there's any additional questions for us, please do so. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rosemarie. And we are out of time, so I do just want to leave you with, there is a slide here with the resources. Again, I did mention that at this time we're unable to put the handout of the PDF into the handout pod, but when we do post this to our website, we will make sure that the resources is in a separate place so that you can access all of those handouts and links that we've talked about today. There was a previous Safety Center webinar in April of 2017 on converting paved roads to unpaved roads and the NCHRP synthesis that Rosemarie talked about. That can be found on our archive training page if you do want more information about that. Lastly, we have a couple of upcoming webinars. Make sure you get signed up for those as well. There's one on December 12th, The Culture of the Swedish Vision Zero, and on January 18th on pedestrian treatments at uncontrolled locations. The FHWA Office of Tribal Transportation has also asked us to announce that they are doing a Proven Safety Countermeasures webinar on Tuesday, January 23rd that you can sign up for as well. We'll post that on our website along with this link for how to register for it too. And again, if you have any final contact or questions, you can feel free to reach our speakers. Their emails are now shown on your screen. We do want to thank you for joining us today and apologize for going over just a little bit. Thank you to LTAP, a safety work group, for co-hosting today's presentation with us. And thank you very much, Rosemarie, Ken, and David, for speaking today. We really do truly appreciate it. Everyone have a great afternoon.